Absolutely. You spend so much time with your coworkers, with your boss. And I think for a lot of ADHDers, there's a relationship aspect, but there's the performance aspect as well, right? We want to do a good job. When we can't figure something out, we hyperfixate on it and we want to make sure that we can do it. And if you don't have that great relationship, it only magnifies what can already feel like a painful thing, especially for folks that have rejection sensitivity. If you are doing something not great at work and you don't have a great boss, it can just intensify those feelings and really cause kind of a domino effect in your personal life as well.
Yes, and I think a lot of anxiety too, because then you start to anticipate what's the next bad thing that's going to happen. Or am I going to be scrutinized for this thing? So I think that's number one.
Welcome back to the NITW Podcast, hosted by Neurodiversity in the Workplace. My name is Krista Deguffroy. I'm a senior consultant here at Neurodiversity in the Workplace, where we work with companies and partners to create a more neuro-inclusive world of work. I'm joined today by Dr. Gilly Kahn. Gilly, would you mind introducing yourself and telling our listeners a little bit about you?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast, Krista. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Dr. Gilly Kahn. I'm a psychologist, a mom, and now an author. And I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm part of a group practice. I work in Atlanta, and most of my clients are neurodivergent. And so am I. I have ADHD. I got a late diagnosis in my early 30s, and it was something that I suspected for many years. And then after having my daughter, I finally went and got diagnosed and started on medication. So I feel comfortable working and feel in my element, working with other people who are neurodivergent. So it's not surprising to me. That's just where I was drawn to. And yeah.
Awesome. I think our listeners are going to be really excited about our conversation today. On the NITW podcast, we talk a lot about neurodivergence, neuroinclusion, the world of work. We don't always get to dive deep into one neurotype. So I think that there's going to be a lot of listeners who are excited today to dive in pretty much on the topic of ADHD. You know, when I have read your work and I've followed your journey, sometimes I feel like I'm looking into a mirror where it's like copy and paste our experiences. So it's very exciting for me as well to be able to interview you and just to hear about your journey. I want to take us maybe back to the beginning. You had talked a lot about in your works about growing up and recognizing some of these behaviors now that we know are under the umbrella of ADHD. But you talked about being labeled as emotional or even a difficult child. Would you mind maybe sharing with our listeners a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so my book, which I have here, is about emotional dysregulation and how the current diagnostic criteria for ADHD don't include emotional dysregulation. And so that's where those descriptors, I think, fit for people with ADHD, especially adults who are diagnosed in adulthood. So people who are diagnosed as adults look back on those descriptors from childhood, and a lot of them can relate to them. They remember being called too emotional, too sensitive, too much. And then even as far as other people conceptualizing their behaviors as personality flaws. So they'll call them rude, selfish, stubborn, like intrusive, just a lot of really hurtful labels. And within the criteria, there are specific symptoms that could explain some of those labels. Interrupting, but there's one type of interrupting and there's another type of interrupting. Which is funny because the title of my book is Allow Me to Interrupt. But one type of interrupting is you're just like really excited and then you share information or a joke or something and then everyone around you laughs. But another type of interrupting is correcting someone or interrupting because you're angry. Mm. And so it's really difficult to tease out emotion from those impulsive behaviors. connected to ADHD, yet emotions are not woven into the criteria currently. And so that's very confusing to people. And I think, and this is something that Dr. Russell Barkley has written about for many years, and his lectures on this topic are just fascinating in terms of the history of emotional dysregulation and its role in attention disorders since about the 1700s. It's so cool. Yet we still don't use that to diagnose ADHD. So that's where I think those labels really come from. It's from misunderstanding people, and that misunderstanding doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's the result of there not being appropriate criteria to fully describe the condition.
Yeah. What I think is so interesting is that misunderstanding follows people. It's not something that misunderstanding of behaviors or how a child may act, it's not something that's just misunderstood from 0 to 5, or it doesn't stop when we turn 18. Those misunderstandings follow us into adulthood. My favorite, and if my mom ever listens to this podcast, she'll hear it, but I was labeled as too thin-skinned. That was always the feedback I got. I'm too sensitive. I need a thicker skin. And that followed me into even my first job as a working professional. It was always the thing that I needed to work on. And I would internalize that. It was never that I was empathetic or that I felt the energies of what was happening in the workplace, but we peel out those negative descriptors and they follow us into adulthood, which I just think is so interesting, knowing what we know now about the neurotype and what the research tells us. And for amazing work like yours, talking about the emotional components of ADHD, that we still, as a society, fall into the negatives and the things that only paint the neurotype in certain ways. So I appreciate you for what you do in trying to change the narrative on the topic. But I do want to ask, knowing what you know now and having diagnosis as an adult, being a parent, but still working with youth, how does your knowledge change how you might show up in your practice? Are there things that you do differently now or ways that you might approach the folks that you work with in a new way?
Yeah, so I think there were two aspects that kind of came up in my mind when you asked that question. One is me as an employee, like how I handle that. What kind of an employee do I want to be? What kind of workplace do I want to be in? And then there's the work that I do with clients that honestly I think hasn't changed at all since I got my diagnosis, because I'm still the same person. I think, and it wasn't like a surprise to me. I went and I sought out I knew I had ADHD. I just procrastinated like we all do when we have ADHD. When I had horrible migraine attacks, I procrastinated getting treatment for that too, which is ridiculous. And then I get really mad at myself. Why did I waste all those years without treatment? I'm sure a lot of people with ADHD could relate to that. But I don't know. I just knew what's up. And I'm not, that's the thing. I think we all have this fear of people viewing us as super cocky. But what I found is that adults who are neurodivergent, and kids too, when they find their thing, they're so good at it. And I think we know we have weaknesses. We hear enough of that. But when we know we're good at something, I think it's so special and important to just own it. And for me, that's individual therapy. Like, I feel like I know what I'm doing. I'm surprised when something doesn't work out. I mean, no one's perfect, right? But I feel like, especially with this population, it just clicked from an early age. Since I was 19, I worked at a school for autistic kids over the summer, one summer, and it was just a coincidence. It was a job, and I ended up loving it. And that's where I started down the neurodiversity path. But it was just, I don't know, I just felt this connection with those kids. And so I forgot where the question was going. But anyway, I was going to say that, so how do I make that work? So with clients, I feel like it takes one to know one. And so I kind of get it. I can't explain it. It's just sort of fluid. And the other thing is, because I have ADHD and I was late diagnosed, but I also got a PhD. It's like I had to learn all these workarounds
Yeah.
and these ways to make it through. And so I teach a lot of those strategies to my clients. And through my experience of working with clients, also, I get a sense of what helps people, what doesn't help people, all building on my training in psychology.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then in terms of being an employee, that's something that when you get a PhD, and I got a master's first, like you don't go out into the workforce until much later. And I also had my daughter while I was in the PhD program, so everything just kept getting pushed. It's hard to be a woman and to want to be a mom and to also work and have a higher degree. It takes a long time, but so it's still a learning process for me. But from what I've learned so far, I think the most important thing is if you have a boss, you better fucking like them. Like, if you're neurodivergent, because if you don't, there's going to be real problems. And so that's number one. And even if you're not, I mean, there's research also on happiness levels, like across the lifespan. And what one of the key things that can affect how happy you are is whether you like or dislike your boss.
It does.
It seems like such a small thing, but it's huge. You spend so much of your time working.
Absolutely. You spend so much time with your coworkers, with your boss, and that relationship. And I think for a lot of ADHDers, there's a relationship aspect, but there's the performance aspect as well, right? We want to do a good job. When we can't figure something out, we hyperfixate on it and we want to make sure that we can do it. And if you don't have that great relationship, it only magnifies what can already feel like a painful thing, especially for folks that have rejection sensitivity. If you are doing something not great at work and you don't have a great boss, it can just intensify those feelings and really cause kind of a domino effect in your personal life as well.
Yeah. Yes. And I think a lot of anxiety too, because then you start to anticipate what's the next bad thing that's going to happen. Or am I going to be scrutinized for this thing? So I think that's number one. Number two, I think the schedule that you have is important. So if you're expected to be, because I've been in an internship where actually it was during COVID, so it was the first half of COVID, and I was so grateful. I mean, I wasn't grateful about COVID, but I was just like, if this is going to hit, this is the right time for it to hit. Because now the 9 to 5 internship, where like I had to be at the site. My office had no windows and it was tiny and you couldn't leave. Everything was like fluorescent. It was horrible. And I think that I don't get it. Like neurotypicals could just live like that. I remember there was one change, I think, in my routine because they were doing construction and I had to drive to a different site in the middle of the day. Oh my God, those 15 minutes. How I would like suck in the sun, roll down my windows. I mean, it's inhumane. And I think for someone who finds it really hard to sit still and who needs like sunlight, like dopamine, it's just, yeah. So I think that your schedule is really important. And I think the type of work schedule that tends to really help people or work well for people with ADHD is work schedules with variability and some structure. Like you're doing something similar. Like for me, the way I make that work for me is I have a lot of different kinds of clients. I see kids, I see adults in their 50s and their 60s, and then I also work with college students and different conditions. So I could be working with someone with Tourette's and then working with someone with OCD. I mean, typically those go hand in hand, but maybe I'm doing CBIT, this is therapy for Tourette's with one person, and then I'm on a different stage with someone else or something like that. So I think varying it up and I think not overloading yourself.
Yeah. Which I think those are all habits that I think when we work with candidates and we work with neurodivergent job seekers, they crave that. So I love hearing that those are some things that you've incorporated into your work life as well as an employee, and getting to work with now other folks that are either professionals or heading into the professional world so they can kind of get that, what's the word I'm looking for, that regulation by having those variances in their workday or setting their workdays up for success as much as they can.
Yeah.
We don't always have control over things, but it is really great to see where we can infuse good practices that help our brains and our body just feel better.
Yeah.
I did ask you, I was thinking as you were talking about working in the whole spectrum of ages and places of life, working with children, teens, adults, I wanted to ask you about kind of maybe the cycle of where we see like high achievement from starting at a young age, great grades, top of the class. And then we oftentimes hear these stories of as we enter teens and early adulthood, this like feeling of burnout, this crash where we can't move forward or even early in our careers. And we often talk about the cycle of masking and how that shows up at work, but I'd love to get your perspective on how this may start as even young children and where you see this kind of show up with ADHD clients and individuals.
Yeah, I think you could be struggling at school and still be perfectionistic. So maybe you're not at the top of your class, but your goal. And I'm thinking about, again, I feel like there's just like a lot of different parts to that question. For one, from what I've experienced, at least with teens and with youth, is a lot of the neurodivergent children and teens who I work with, most of their complaints revolve around the content at school. Like they love to learn. And I'd say that a lot of them, there's some who are less ambitious, but I would say a lot of them are. They're very ambitious. And it's about, again, like I said before, and I have a chapter on that, on finding your passion. Once they find the thing or things that they love, then they continue doing that. And they end up doing pretty well in that. For example, I found a lot of teens who are neurodivergent are very creative. They'll love creative writing, like me, which is fun. I love when that happens. A lot of them will like acting or theater as part of the theater program at school. And they end up from a young age like succeeding, like getting a really good role in the play or getting it like an agent for acting, getting something published in a magazine. And that's really cool and amazing. But they also get this external pressure of having to go to a great college or having to get straight A's, whether that's, I think it's a very big, like westernized, like American thing, where there's a lot of pressure on career and prestige, as opposed to, I think, interest and creativity and growth and like love of learning. So I think they get lost in that. And then they get so focused on getting like a certain SAT or ACT score. And that's where the frustration, I think, and the burnout begins, because they're pushing themselves toward a goal that's so superficial. I mean, because you could become successful in your field and not necessarily go to Harvard.
Yeah.
But I think that they don't necessarily see that. And I think they're very big, like, it's not, I don't think it's only internal. I think I would say it's mostly environmental from what I've experienced. So a lot of them complain about the subjects, like the content that is taught at school. I don't want to become a mathematician. Why do I have to get an A in this? Why do I have to get this score on this section of the SAT? And I think they're valid questions, and I kind of just commiserate with them because I agree. It's very frustrating. I mean, on the one hand, you need to have a basic understanding of these areas within education, but then there's all of this pressure to I think, overperform.
Yeah. And I loved what you said about there's a lot of external factors too. I think for a lot of ADHDers, we like to look ahead in the future. We like to plan. We like to see where things can go. And maybe sometimes not knowing where life is going to take you, that ambiguity can cause a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of distress. I'm guessing that maybe you went through some of that too. But we hear a lot from our clients that we work with, from candidates, job seekers, their families, just about the unknown and how much that stresses them out. And when we think about a 2026 job market, we see a lot of students who are graduating and heading into the unknown. Are there conversations that you have either with students or with adults or with your clients about how to navigate some of that ambiguity and try to have some of that regulation inside?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess what I would normally tell a client if this issue came up is I would say there are things you can control and there are things you can't. And I think sometimes you can find information, like if you really want to find it. And that's actually what I learned the second time around when I applied. Sometimes there are forums and you can find the information if you really need it. Yeah. And I also think, I think if it's possible, it's also empowering. If you have a question, ask if you're able to get an answer. But if it's the kind of situation where there is no answer, there's no way for you to find out the answer, then what can you do in the meantime that's values-based, that's meaningful to you, where, you know, you're distracting yourself, but in a purposeful way. Like, for example, I work with people like young adults who are applying for internships or jobs, and they apply to one. I'm like, okay, keep on trucking, what's next? Because once that one is simmering, that application, you know, you're going to move on and send the next one. Because I've learned through my experience, like, you need to cast a wide net. You can't just assume that if you apply to 5 that you think are a good fit, that you're going to get something. So that keeps you busy, it keeps the ball rolling, and then it passes the time.
Yeah. I want to get your thoughts on kind of a more recent phenomenon, maybe in the last few years, that we hear a lot about is the professional ghosting, where candidates are applying for jobs and they might submit 20 applications. They've crafted a beautiful cover letter or statement of interest, and they don't hear back. We hear a lot from candidates who do have ADHD just around how almost emotionally hurtful that is. They feel personally rejected. Want to get your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, I experienced that as a writer where you pitch an idea and then you don't hear back. Or with the media also, it's similar. You know, they don't respond to you. But what I found though is that most organizations will let you know. Like, they'll have on their website, due to the large volume of applications, we may not be able to respond to every single person. But if you haven't heard from us after 6 weeks, that means it's a rejection. So if they don't have information like that anywhere available online, that's when I would recommend asking. So call or email, and if one email address doesn't work, see if there's a second one. And then at that point, you need to raise your hands. One type of therapy that I love using is acceptance and commitment therapy.
Interesting.
And that type of therapy is like a branch of cognitive behavior therapy. It was developed in the 80s by Hayes, and then Russ Harris has kind of simplified the strategies in ACT and has a ton of YouTube videos, like cartoons, that relay the information in a really fun way. But basically, ACT involves a lot of, it's called acceptance and commitment. So involves a lot of acceptance strategies like mindfulness, by identifying your values. So I love to start therapy with that, with identifying what's important to you, because you can ask yourself in terms of the way that you're behaving or a thought that pops into your mind. If you have the thought, I may as well give up, is that bringing you closer to the things that you care about, or is it pushing you farther away? So you continuously checking your email to see if the person responded to you, is that bringing you closer to your values or pushing you farther away? Chances are it's pushing you farther away because it's increasing your anxiety. It's not changing the outcome. So the question is, what do you need to do to be more values-based or more purposeful and not waste your time and increase your anxiety? And as someone with ADHD, that's probably going to mean get the fuck away from your phone, put it away, leave it in your room, go out for a walk. Sometimes you just need that. You need to restrain yourself and not give yourself access to it. So that way you can just cognitively regroup, take a break from it, remind yourself what actually matters to you, and what you're feeling. Identify what you're feeling. I'm feeling anxious. Why? Because this is really important to me, because I really want this. So now what's the next step? Are we going to harp over the fact that you haven't gotten this email? Or are you going to try to change the approach or try it again?
I love too that in this conversation around ghosting or around feeling really emotionally tied to one aspect of that is the work shouldn't all be on just the candidate or just the job seeker or the individual. I think we are really proud of when we do work with our partners is understanding that the world of work is emotional. The world of work isn't solely transactional. It's not something that we turn our hearts and brains off from, not only during 9 to 5 and then we turn it off. There's a complete emotional aspect and commitment that happens even from the time that you're browsing the careers page or thinking about whether or not to support a business. And I'm really proud of thinking about our clients, just them kind of understanding that shift too, that work is emotional for people and that it's not, I send an application and then I just move on, but that people do put their time and commitment in there. So it's been really encouraging to see over the years how more companies are shifting to being employee focused or being more human centered in their approach and in their communications. Okay. One of the things I wanted to revisit with you, we started to talk a little bit about the workplace and things that didn't work well for you in that beginning of COVID and how you were so thankful to just even have that bit of time in your car or being able to work from home. I wanted to talk to you and learn more about maybe some ADHD workplace pain points, whether people maybe work from home or they're in an office. Are there things that you commonly hear or work with clients about when it comes to the world of work?
Yeah, I mean, definitely some of the things that I mentioned before. I think people get burnt out from having to do the same thing or feeling like they're running on a hamster wheel. So injecting some variability into your day. Also having to sit still for long periods of time. For me and the people I've spoken to also, I think the social component could be awful too. Like, for example, like right now you can't see it, but I'm sitting in a very strange way. And that's because I can't concentrate, like with my feet. I remember I used to listen when I was preparing for the SATs when I was young. They used to have us listen through like a cassette tape with the headphones. It was old fashioned even then. I'm not that old, but she used to repeat herself. I remember she used to say, make sure that your feet are flat on the ground. And people have this assumption that everyone concentrates the best sitting straight up. And that is like a nightmare for me and for other people who are autistic and or ADHD. We don't sit like other human beings. And like, that's not considered acceptable. If you're sitting in a team meeting and then you kick your shoes off and you're sitting like scrunched up or crisscross applesauce in your chair, that's considered disrespectful. But I think that's stupid. Who cares how you're sitting as long as you're there paying attention and engaged? So yeah, I think the unspoken social rules, those can really get us. And this is just like a mild example. There's problems, like I said before, with when you interrupt, but it's considered like a socially inappropriate way. Or if you correct someone, I know, autistic people and a lot of people with ADHD too, they've got in the popular media, they talk about like justice sensitivity and just can't stand when something they really care about or they have a special interest in is stated incorrectly. It feels like physical torture inside your body. Or if, you're surprised or disappointed or any big emotion that hits you, it's difficult to inhibit that in your response when you have ADHD. And so if you have a team meeting and then someone says something incorrectly and you go, actually, and you correct them and you're laughing because it happens to all of us, like they get really pissed. But you weren't trying to insult anyone. You were just like, that information isn't correct and let me correct it. It's coming from a benign place. But then that gets factored into your annual review. And then I think some of us also, although we might respond emotionally face to face, I think after a certain number of years of experiencing that, where you are emotional and then getting negative feedback, in a sense, you kind of, I think, develop a tougher skin, but almost too tough to the point where you don't show any emotion because you don't feel safe around the person. So that's where the mask comes on. You close the veil and they don't get to see any of it. And then you go home and you're like decaying, like on the inside. Yeah.
I did laugh when you were talking about that because it's so true. I used to joke, I am the worst card player of all time because if I feel like something's wrong or if I feel like somebody is saying something with malice or saying something that is just factually incorrect and has the potential to do harm, it is all over my face. I can't hide it at all unless it's someone that I don't feel safe around. And then at that point, it's just a stone.
Exactly.
They're not safe. And I just think it's so common
Right.
and it's so prevalent that when people have reached that state of like stone where they're just not going to let you in, it's because of these small infractions over and over again. That's just really tough for people to navigate at work. And unfortunately, it can sometimes spill over into our personal life unintentionally, but it robs us of that joy of a place that we spend the bulk of working hours at is with colleagues or in situations that aren't always the most positive.
And then they call you a stone.
Yeah.
Or like they criticize you. Like they'll say you're cold or emotionless. You're just like, me?
You're like, no, I don't want to get told that I was too emotional again. But yeah,
Yes.
I would say if you could wave a magic wand and change one of the rules about work, what would it be?
For people to like relax. I don't know. I think, yeah, I mean, I guess you need to have structure and rules, but I think there's too much judgment. Like, just, it's like there were things that my dad said that were kind of fucked up while I was growing up, but there were other things that were actually very wise. And one of the things I sometimes say that he told me was like, keep your eyes on your own plate. Like whenever I would argue with my brother, he'd be like, look at your own plate. Like he has more, that kind of thing. And I think that sometimes it would help people in social situations if they just kept their eyes on their own plate. Just be nice to people, assume that they're trying the good in them, that they're trying to be nice or contribute. And if you're not sure about something, just ask. What I really appreciate about the neurodivergent community, it's very direct. If I'm confused about, even in therapy, if I have a client and they're autistic or they have ADHD and I'm confused by how they're feeling, I'll just ask them, how are you feeling? What are you thinking? But I feel like people generally don't do that in day-to-day interactions. They just assume. And unfortunately, I think in our case, a lot of times the assumption is wrong and it's in a very like blaming kind of way. And the relationship would work so much better if it was more transparent and less judgmental.
Yeah. And I think that transparency oftentimes falls on the weight of the individual. And we talk about this a lot around the conversation of disclosure, right? I'm very transparent with people. I tell them I lead with ADHD. ADHD is in the driver's seat pretty much at all times. And if I am interrupting, if it seems like I need to correct something, etc., it is part of who I am. It's part of how my brain works. But I had to make the choice to tell people that and to share that information. And that choice can be really scary, especially if it's your first time, if it's your first working relationship, or it's your first personal relationship. How do you think about navigating disclosure, either for yourself or with your clients? And is there advice you would give to our listeners on the topic of disclosure?
Yeah, I think it's different for everyone and what kind of a situation you're in. Like I described in graduate school when I did my internship, that's just where I matched. I didn't have a choice. It just would happen that way. And I basically had to just deal with it because I wanted to get my PhD and this is what it took. But I think that once you grow up and you have some more flexibility in choosing your work environment and deciding where do I want to work and what kind of people do I want to work with. For me, I think it's a little bit different because I wrote a book about ADHD and it's part memoir. When I was hired into my current practice, like she obviously knew I had ADHD, but I found that it's actually really great when you're able to be open about that, especially when there's other people in your work environment who are open too. And they're just like, oh yeah, I get that. No, I have ADHD too. It's just normal. So I think it's more comfortable, definitely easier if you can find a work environment where you can be open. But there are also situations, like I said before, where you may not necessarily feel comfortable sharing that you have a certain condition, and that's okay. I think it's not sustainable long term. But if there's a light at the end of the tunnel and there's purpose to it, then, it's you do the best that you can. Hopefully you're working with a therapist or someone who can support you, talk to you outside of those environments. But sometimes it's something you just need to do.
Like, I have to tell you, this has been a very fun conversation, and I have just really enjoyed learning about you, your journey, your practice. But before we wrap our podcast today, I do want to make sure that our listeners get to learn a little bit more about you as an author. So can you tell our listeners more about your book, what they can potentially look forward to in reading it, and where they can find it?
Absolutely. Yeah, the title of my book is Allow Me to Interrupt, A Psychologist Reveals the Emotional Truth Behind Women's ADHD. And it's about the emotional dysregulation aspect of ADHD. I write a lot about rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or RSD, in the book as well. And what I love about writing the book, and then also how it came out, is that it reads kind of like a story. And it reads that way because I've been talking about psychology this whole time, but my special interest besides psychology is creative writing. And I majored in creative writing in college, and I had the goal to publish a book since I was 14. I would write fiction for fun. I'm actually working on a fiction book now. So I just love writing. And I think that this book stands out in that way in comparison to other books that might sound a little bit more technical. Or, I mean, this is a self-help book too, but while you're reading, it's not going to feel so much like you're reading a self-help book because it flows. And I've heard that feedback from other people. And then where can you find it? You can find it on Amazon for sure, and possibly a few other platforms, but definitely Amazon has very good stock, and you can also check it out on my website, which is drgillykahn.com.
Amazing. I'm sure our listeners are also going to be really excited to read more of your story and to continue following you on social channels. But thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. And thank you to our listeners for checking out another episode of the NITW podcast.